Hi again, guys. I'm going to talk to you today about Plato some more. So we're still on the foundations of our course on history and principles of literary criticism, and it's even, in a sense, the same foundation, but we're moving up, of course, from the little and, as it were, portable dialogue of Plato's, the Ion, with which we have spent the last couple of lectures, and we're going to take a look for this and the next several lectures at the much larger and much more consequential work of Plato's. It's in fact his masterwork known as the Republic. We are not reading the whole thing, goodness knows. We are just reading Book 10 of the Republic, or part of Book 10 of the Republic, which, and this, as I will suggest several times, this matters, I think, quite a bit. Book 10 is the last book of Plato's Republic, so we're actually reading the conclusion to the whole text and the whole argument. So what I want to do right now is just orient ourselves in this text, first of all, which we actually can do, I think, quite briefly, and I hope a little bit interestingly. And then we'll go on to look at how this argument, this discussion in Plato's Republic, ends up or turns into a discussion about some questions in literary criticism and also, I would say, literary theory. Initially, of course, as those of you who have worked with Plato before will certainly know, initially the Republic has nothing to do with literature, nothing to do with literary criticism. It's a long dialogue between Socrates and, for the most part, a group of young aristocratic Athenians into the nature of justice. That's the topic. All of Plato's dialogues, of course, having one topic or issue that animates and informs them. So the Republic is an inquiry into the nature of justice, but it's justice, and this we need, I think, to be quite clear about. It's justice in a very broad sense. We're not talking in the Republic about any conception of positive law or how to interpret legal judgments or anything like that. We're talking about justice, or we're not talking about social justice, as we say now, either in Plato's Republic. We're talking about a broad, perhaps even vague conception of goodness, rightness, of the correct moral attitude to take toward life and toward one's fellow human beings. So the question, what is justice, that animates the Republic, we can articulate or understand as something like, what is the right way to think about goodness? Or to put it even more kind of reductively, but not incorrectly, I don't think, the question is it good to be good, let's say? Is it good to be good, or is that just a sucker's game, being the good guy in this or that situation? And early in the dialogue, of course, Socrates has a very famous exchange. And you guys don't need to know these details. This is just filling in background. Socrates has a very famous exchange with a character called Thrasymachus, who gives the kind of off-the-rack frat boy ancient view of what justice is. First of all, Thrasymachus says, you know, what a stupid question. What's justice? We all know what justice is, Socrates. What is it? I'll tell you, Thrasymachus says. It's helping your friends and harming your enemies. That's justice. Which is a definition of justice that Socrates very easily takes apart early in the dialogue, and Thrasymachus leaves. But I introduce that into our discussion of the background just because of the terrible and yet, as it were, intelligible possibility that Thrasymachus puts on the table and that the dialogue is trying to forestall or disprove. It's the possibility, again, that justice or goodness or rightness or whatever word you want to use, that's just for suckers. In the real world, justice is about power. Power and outcomes, selfish outcomes. That's the kind of view that Plato's Thrasymachus articulates, and that's the conclusion, as it were, that the whole dialogue is trying to forestall. Just before we move on from this first part of our look at our text, there is another bit of background, a piece of historical background, actually, that I think we do need to know about in order to have our encounter with this text. The historical background, which Plato in various ways invokes quite explicitly at the beginning of the Republic. The historical background is the background of the Peloponnesian War, the terrible, devastating war between Athens and Sparta, these two Greek city-states, a war which was very bloody and destructive, and a war that Athens ultimately lost, and lost completely and devastatingly. Athens and Sparta, of course, are sort of like rival versions of ancient Greek civilization. What's Athens in the ancient world? Athens is cultured. Athens is liberal. Athens is at least quasi-democratic. What's Sparta in the ancient world? Sparta is brutal. Sparta is coarse. Sparta is autocratic and militaristic. So at least in the way these cities' reputations have come down to us, so to speak, the Athens versus Sparta cage match is very much a good guy versus bad guy cage match. In the Peloponnesian War, the bad guy won. Plato, again, is situating this dialogue, the Republic, very much on that historical background, and that's why we have this inquiry into the nature of justice or goodness or rightness. There seems to be some evidence from the world, let's say, that good guys finish last, bad guys win. That's a terrible possibility, and a possibility that in the wake of the Peloponnesian War, Plato is writing this dialogue, I think, to try to forestall or disprove. Okay, moving on, a little bit more background before we get to our argument. Early on in the Republic, this long work, most of which we are not reading, Socrates and his interlocutors, who, by the way, are Plato's older brothers, Glaucon and Adimantus. Socrates and his interlocutors run into this definition problem, which actually we've already run into in our discussion today. What is justice? Well, the first thing we have to do is say, what do you mean by justice? Is it goodness, rightness, social justice? You know, what is it? There's a definition problem which Socrates proposes to solve as follows. He says, or not solve, to get around as follows. Socrates says, okay, look, maybe we have trouble saying exactly what we mean by justice, but let's also reckon that we kind of know it when we see it. So we can have confidence in our ability, our moral intuition about what's just and what is not just. So let's do this, Socrates says early in the Republic. Let's design what we take to be an imaginary ideal society. So it's a kind of Platonic SimCity game that he proposes to play. Let's design an imaginary ideal society. If it's an ideal society, it'll have to be just, right? Yes, Socrates, it will have to be just, Socrates. Exactly so, Socrates. If it's an ideal society, it'll have to be just by definition. So if we put all the right pieces together, justice will be there somehow. Justice will emerge as an aspect, a controlling aspect or organizing aspect of our imaginary ideal city. So let's design our republic, the political entity of the title, and then examine it, and we'll find justice there. That's the extended thought experiment that the dialogue becomes. And so Socrates and his young friends, they go into everything. How should we organize property in our ideal society? What should marital relations be like in our ideal society? Who should be in government? What kind of government? What will be the nature of social hierarchy? How will education work? Etc., etc., etc. Every aspect of what makes a city, a polis, a civilization from the ancient Greek perspective, they consider and they add into their imaginary ideal society in what they take to be an ideal or perfected form. And at a certain point in the dialogue, this attempt to construct an ideal society leads them to consider the role of literature and of art in their ideal society. And there is an issue here that I want to highlight for tutorial. We're going to talk, Socrates in Republic is going to talk about literature in quite a general way. He's also going to talk about art, visual art, in quite a general way. And his primary target, again, as in the Ion, seems to be Homer and the tremendous cultural and moral authority that the Greeks accorded to Homer's writings, as we've been discussing over the last few lectures. But Socrates often works through metaphors or images that are actually drawn from visual art, from painting in particular. And so again, I'm just highlighting that as kind of a curious aspect of his argument in the Republic, and one that I would like us to come back to in tutorial. Okay, moving on. So again, they're constructing this ideal society. They're thinking about everything that goes into a society, regulating everything in what they think to be an ideal or perfect manner. And that, at some point, leads them to consider the role of literature, which, as we have been discussing, the Greeks took very, very seriously and actually saw as a site or source of wisdom, of knowledge. Plato presents Socrates' philosophy very much as a challenge to that literary conception of what knowledge basically was. The issue of literature comes up twice, interestingly, in the Republic. The first time is quite early on. It's in Book 2, which we're not reading. And in that first kind of kick at the can, Socrates and his interlocutors decide quite quickly and quite easily that the role of literature in their ideal society should effectively be no role at all. Their preference is to ban literature, especially what we're going to call representational literature. In other words, literature that purports to tell stories about the world. So banning poetry, banning literature from the Republic. That's the policy that Socrates and his friends come up with very early on in the Republic, as I said, in Book 2. And in that first kick at the can, that first kick of the can outside the ideal city, let's say, the issues that, that Socrates is basically concerned about are moral. So the concern is that literature fundamentally is a bad influence on people. What do you have when you read this or that story of Greek mythology? What do you have? What do you get when you read Homer? Well, for the most part, you're getting stories of gods and heroes misbehaving. You know, the gods in Greek mythology, they're always falling in and out of bed with each other, all that kind of sordid stuff. The heroes in Homer, well, if we take a closer look at them, they are exceedingly violent, for one thing, quite uncaringly violent, as a matter of fact. At the same time, and this Socrates really doesn't like, sometimes those heroes, well, they act like sissies. This is kind of what Socrates says. So Odysseus, for example, he's always crying, Socrates says. What? You want our kids to grow up reading literature where, you know, the ideal man of the ancient world, Odysseus, is always bawling? No. We want our young Athenians, the members of our ideal republic, the young men, and they are very much thinking of men, boys and men. No, we want our young men to be tough, have a stiff upper lip, soldier on through all circumstances. We can't have them reading that Odysseus had feelings. That's, I mean, I'm rendering it slightly facetiously, but not very much. That's the general moral argument that Socrates and his friends make against poetry early in the Republic. And there is, again, an issue for us to discuss in tutorial. Here, on its face at least, it's not a very difficult point, but it is a kind of wonderfully ironic and disturbing and surprising one. As I was saying a moment ago, this text is written against the background of the Peloponnesian War, a war in which, you know, tough, strong, brutal, uncaring Sparta soundly defeated liberal, sensitive, sophisticated, literary Athens. And when we start to read stuff like Socrates' critique of unmanly feelings in Homer, when we start to read stuff like that, it becomes apparent that the ideal society he and his friends are constructing doesn't actually sound all that much like Athens. It actually sounds quite a bit more like Sparta, and that just may be slightly ironic and therefore slightly suspicious. But again, that's something that I would like us, if we can, to come back to and talk about in tutorial. Okay. That brings us to the end of the background part of this lecture. They deal with poetry, with literature in general, art in general, but poetry at the center. They deal with poetry, especially narrative poetry, in Book 2, exile it basically from the city. The only kind of literature that Socrates is willing to allow is the kind, well, a kind in which strong men do strong manly things and praise the gods and stuff like that. Then in Book 10, at the very end of the Republic, in the concluding book, the issue of literature comes up again. And it certainly, I think, is very, very kind of tantalizing and striking and interesting that that Socrates already kicked right outside the city walls in Book 2. He has to kick it again. It comes up again at the end of Book 10, and that, of course, I think suggests or implies that there's more to it than may have appeared the first time around. Nonetheless, we then turn to Socrates' I think very, very fascinating and remarkable and again foundational discussion in Book 10 of the Republic. Our questions once more. This literature business, is it any good? And if so, what is it good for? Now I'm going to turn to the text, and I will ask you guys to follow along with your copies in the PDF that I have posted to the Canvas page. I'm on, at the beginning, page 1, this exchange between Socrates and Glaucon. And again, we're almost at the end of this long work. We're in the last book, and Socrates and Glaucon are kind of looking back with satisfaction over the ideal society they have constructed. And they did actually come up with an answer to the question, what is justice? But we don't need to worry about that. I would say it's a somewhat disappointing answer. They're looking back, you know, kicking back almost in Book 10 of the Republic, and praising their own work and praising each other, you know, like you do after working all week with your buddies. You were so awesome. No, you were so awesome. That kind of thing. Socrates says here at the beginning of our PDF, he says, "Of the many excellences which I perceive in the order of our state, there is none which upon reflection pleases me better than the rule about poetry." Glaucon says, "To what do you refer?" Socrates answers, "To the rejection of imitative poetry, which certainly ought not to be received, as I see far more clearly now that the parts of the soul have been distinguished." Glaucon, what do you mean? Oh, and when we're reading this version of the text, the editor, Benjamin Jowett, has has simply omitted kind of, speech indicators. But it's quite repetitive the way the dialogue works. Basically, all the kind of straight man nothing questions. What do you mean, Socrates? Or responses. It is true, Socrates. All of that boring stuff, little one-line stuff, that's Glaucon answering Socrates. The long, interesting stuff, that's all Socrates talking. So we have very much in the Republic, to connect this to part of our discussion of the Ion, we have very much a Socrates in control in Republic Book 10. So what do you mean? Glaucon asks. Speaking in confidence, for I should not like to have my words repeated to the tragedians and the rest of the imitative tribe, but I do not mind saying to you that all poetical imitations are ruinous to the understanding of the hearers, and that the knowledge of their true nature is the only antidote to them. Explain the purport of your remark, Glaucon says. Well, I will tell you. Although I have always from my earliest youth had an awe and love of Homer, which even now makes the words falter on my lips, for he is the great captain and teacher of the whole of that charming tragic company, but a man is not to be reverenced more than the truth, and therefore I will speak out. Very good, he said. Listen to me then, or rather answer me. Put your question. And finally we come to the kind of nub of this part of Plato's discussion. Socrates asks, can you tell me what imitation is? For I really do not know. What's imitation? And I want to pause there to do a little bit of, I think, very important work with vocabulary. It isn't difficult, but it is needed, and it will pay rich dividends. It's about that word imitation. We're getting a translation there of a Greek term, which I would like to reintroduce, actually, and use in our discussion, because it is a term that we will find used in discussions of literary theory and literary criticism. The term is mimesis, M-I-M-E-S-I-S, mimesis. That's the Greek word that is being translated, and that's the word that actually I would like us to import and use as a technical term for our own purposes. Mimesis means imitation, copying something, and also means representation, giving a picture or an artistic version of something. Mimesis is what a work of art does when it gives you a picture, in one sense or another, of the world. That's mimesis. And we can say that a kind of art that does that is mimetic. So if you are watching a lecture, for example, by a pedantic professor who has certain gestures, perhaps uses his hands in a certain way, ruffles his hair, you might amuse yourself and your friends by mimicking that person. Your performance of that person's gestures, voice, hair ruffling, etc., we would say your performance for your friends, making them laugh, we would say your performance is mimetic, right? You're imitating, mimicking, giving a copy or a picture or a representation of your professor in that example. The way art gives a copy or an imitation or a picture of the world, that's mimesis. The art, of course, is not the world. The art is not real. It only represents, imitates, gives you a pretend version of the world. And again, nothing strange or exotic there. We all know what we're talking about. All we're doing really for the moment is giving this very, very, I think, useful and very important technical term as a way to talk about that whole business of the way art gives us a copy or a picture of the world. It's mimetic, and we can call that whole phenomenon of representational art, we can call that mimesis, okay? Now, at that point, perhaps regrettably, I have to take one step back in the lecture and just add in a little bit more background. In this case, it's background about the nature of Plato's philosophy in general. Plato's philosophy, as he puts it in the mouth of Socrates, is a kind of philosophy that we can call an idealism, okay? An idealism. But that is not in a political sense or a moral sense. It's rather in a sense about what fundamentally exists, what in the world that apparently surrounds us fundamentally exists or is essentially real. That's the kind of question that Plato is obsessed with, has at the very roots, let's say, of his philosophy, and we could call it a metaphysical question or an ontological question. We don't really need to do that. What in the world or cosmos is really real? For Plato, the world that we perceive around us as real, these trees, this jaunty umbrella, this picnic table, etc., for Plato, the world that we perceive around us as real isn't really real, okay? The world that we perceive around us is to some extent a deception for Plato. It's to some extent, it has a kind of secondary status versus what actually is real. And Plato has various grounds for arguing that we don't need to go into or know anything about, really, for the purposes of our course. All we need to know is that Plato's philosophy, his metaphysical philosophy, is an idealism involving this notion that the world around us is not really the world as it really is. What's really real, and if you will forgive that circumlocution, we almost can't escape it when we're talking about Platonism. What's really real, so to speak, for Plato are what he calls, are entities that he calls the ideas, or often the term that is given there in English is the forms. But ideas, for our purposes here, may actually be a better word for us to use. The ideas are real for Plato. The world that we see around us is not. It has a secondary status compared to the essential or true reality of these entities, the ideas. And in one way, this aspect of Plato is kind of trippy, even a little bit mystical. Here in our text on page 2, Socrates actually gives what I take to be quite a handy and even sensible explanation of the basic idea of the ideas. So I'm on near the top of page 2 in our PDF, where Socrates says to Glaucon, whenever a number of individuals have a common name, we assume them to have also a corresponding idea or form. Do you understand me? I do. Let us take any common instance. There are beds and tables in the world, plenty of them, are there not? Yes. But there are only 2 ideas or forms of them. One the idea of a bed, the other of a table. True. Socrates goes on, and the maker of either of them, that is to say of a bed or a table, the maker of either of them makes a bed or he makes a table for our use in accordance with the idea. That is our way of speaking in this and similar instances. And I'll pause there. Socrates is asking, well, you know, what makes all these tables tables? And how do they all kind of get to be there in the world, tables? How are we able to make over and over again, if we have that ability, how are we able to make over and over again a table? And how to make all kinds of different tables, and yet we know that they are all tables. What makes them all tables? I promise I'm going to stop saying table very soon. What makes them all tables, and how is it even possible to express these tables? Well, the view Socrates is putting And again, it's not a completely strange or mystical one in this version. The view Socrates is putting is you're only able to make a table in the first instance because you have the idea of a table, right? And it's because you have the idea of a table in your head that you're able to express that idea by making a physical table. And by the same token, that same idea of the table is one that you kind of express over and over again every time you make a table, just as though you have a kind of stamp and you're stamping it into different little, pads of ink over and over again. You've got the table idea, and because you have that table idea, you're able to make tables and fill the world with them, indeed. The physical object, the table, is only kind of a copy or expression of the ideal table which exists at the mental level. And accordingly, it's that mental level that has more reality for Socrates than the physical level. The physical depends on the mental, therefore the mental is more real. That's the argument, which I'm not, by the way, speaking for. I'm just trying to explain what the idea is. In the quote that I just was reading, Socrates goes on to say, so you've got an artificer, by which he means a craftsman. You've got an artificer who makes beds and tables only because he has the idea of that in his head. Nobody makes the ideas. No artificer makes the ideas themselves. No craftsman makes the idea of a bed. I want to give a slight tweak there, which Socrates is going to explain later, but we can just kind of complete the idea ourselves a little bit more quickly. For Plato's Socrates, the ideas are actually made by God. So ideas of things come from the divine level. And it's only because we have those ideas of things that we are able to make physical things. Okay. The critique continues then on page, we're still just on page 2 of our PDF. I'm going to read a little more and then comment a little more. So we've just had Socrates talking about the maker, the craftsman, the carpenter in this case, making beds or tables. Nobody makes the ideas themselves, they just come from God. Socrates goes on to say, and there is another artist. I should like to know what you would say of him. Who is he, asks Glaucon. One who is the maker of all the works of all other workmen. What an extraordinary man. Wait a little, Socrates says, and there will be more reason for your saying so. For this is he who is able to make not only vessels of every kind, but plants and animals, himself and all other things, the earth and heaven, and the things which are in heaven or under the earth. He makes the gods also, this other artificer or maker or artist. He must be a wizard and no mistake, says Glaucon. Socrates answers, oh, you are incredulous, are you? Do you mean that there is no such maker or creator, or that in one sense there might be a maker of all these things, but in another not? Do you see that there is a way in which you could make them all yourself? In which you, Glaucon, Socrates is saying, there's a way in which you could make everything that exists in the world yourself. What way? Glaucon asks. Socrates answers in this very famous passage. He says, an easy way enough, or rather there are many ways in which the feat might be quickly and easily accomplished, none quicker than that of turning a mirror round and round. You would soon enough make the sun and the heavens and the earth and yourself and other animals and plants and all the other things of which we were just now speaking in the mirror. Yes, Glaucon says, but they would be appearances only. That Socrates says, and we agree, I think, he says, very good, you are coming to the point now. Socrates is now arriving at the kind of main line of his critique in this part of the Republic, his critique of literature, his critique of art. And the main line of his critique here, remember I said earlier in Book 2, Socrates was mostly concerned about literature and art morally. In Book 10, he's mostly concerned about literature and art metaphysically. What he's claiming, and the idea itself is not especially difficult, although it is a strange idea. What he's claiming is that art, in the broadest sense, takes us in the wrong direction vis-a-vis reality. Remember, in Socrates' theory, the actual physical object, like a picnic table, is only the copy of an ideal object, the idea of a picnic table, which is made by God and which we have in our minds. So already, when we're sitting at the picnic table, we are sitting in a degraded state with respect to actual or ultimate reality, okay? What then happens, Socrates asks, if somebody, let's say, takes a picture of the picnic table and various objects that are untidily arranged on it for the purposes of trying to give a lecture? What happens if a painter paints the table? Well, what happens is we go from bad to worse, right? The table is already not really real. If we paint the table, we're getting something that is even less real. We're getting a mere appearance, a mere representation of something that is itself already, in a sense, the representation. So I'm going to go through it one more time, because even though the kind of playing pieces that we are dealing with here are not especially complex or slippery, the notion, I won't say idea, the notion, the argument that Socrates is laying on us, overall it is a little bit slippery, and so let's just go through it one more time to make sure that we have it. Socrates is telling a story about a chain of creation, let's say, a chain of making. And it's a chain of making that begins with God, with the divine. God makes the idea of a bed. Socrates proves in a brief little argument that there can only ever be one idea of a bed, but we don't need to go into that part of it. God makes the idea of a bed. The carpenter makes an actual bed. That's a copy of the ideal bed in Socrates' argument. If a painter paints a picture of, if a painter paints a picture of the actual table, he is now making a copy of something that was already a copy, okay? A representation of a representation. And as Socrates says in this very famous formulation, the artwork, the picture, is then thrice removed from the truth. Thrice removed from the truth. Art isn't real, obviously, but it's worse than that in Plato. Art is actively and destructively taking us farther and farther away from reality. And here again, I think, is an issue that we can fruitfully discuss in tutorial, given that we are not in a course right now on how to, so to speak, do literature. We are in a course about how to do literary criticism, and we can easily hang that on to Socrates' chain of representation and see how that will work. We go from God's idea, which is good, we go from God's idea of the bed. Let's use that example now because it's a much more famous one. We go from God's idea of a bed to an actual bed, physical bed. So now we're at stage one of our degradation in terms of ultimate reality. If we then go from an actual physical bed to a painted representation of a bed, we're now at stage two of our degradation in terms of actual or ultimate reality. So think, for example, Vincent van Gogh, as some of you guys will know, has a very famous picture of his bed in his little attic room in Arles. Oh my gosh, that's a copy of a copy, a representation of a representation. It's taking us farther away from the truth. What then happens, to pursue the Van Gogh example, what happens if somebody, let's say, takes a picture of Van Gogh's painting? Well, now we have a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy. Or, by the same token, what happens if somebody, God forbid, writes an essay about Van Gogh's painting in much the same way? That is going to be a further step into the degradation that Socrates is talking about, a further step away from reality and into whatever the opposite of reality is. But whatever it is, it can't be good, right? In Plato. And let me wrap up and try to explain that point a bit more fully, just by returning to some general points about the nature of Plato's philosophy, what Plato's Socrates thinks we should be doing, so to speak. In Plato's idealism in general, what we are supposed to be doing if we're living the philosophical life, the examined life, we're supposed to be trying to transcend the ordinary world, the world around us, of picnic tables and jaunty umbrellas and plants and chirping birds. This world we take to be real, but of course it isn't, Plato says. We're supposed to transcend the ordinary world and go on a kind of philosophical journey, the vector of which is upward. We're supposed to go on a philosophical journey that will lead us up to an understanding of, an encounter with real reality. We're supposed to go on a physical journey, a philosophical journey that will lead us up to knowledge of the ideas or forms, and ultimately it may, we hope, lead us up to the knowledge of what Plato calls the good, which we are to understand as ultimate reality and the nature of God, something like that. So in its full-fledged form, this philosophical journey of Platonism, it is actually really quite interestingly mystical, actually. On the other hand, it involves a lot of math. So it's kind of a good news, bad news story. But nonetheless, the basic idea, once again, is we as Platonists are supposed to move away from this world, which is only a copy of reality, and move, if we can, up toward an encounter with essential or true reality at that level of the forms. And once you have that mapped out, you understand, I hope we understand, quickly and easily what the problem with art is and with literature is from the perspective of Plato's Socrates. Art and literature are taking us in exactly the wrong direction. They are taking us down the ladder of existence rather than up the ladder of existence. And that, for Plato's Socrates, is really disastrous. So the moral argument against art that was introduced earlier in the Republic, we return to it in Book 10, but now really we have a metaphysical argument against art and literature. They are disastrously misleading us about the nature of reality and how we can have an encounter with the nature of reality. And I'll just close with a couple more quotes from our text, page 13. Because the text does meander a bit, and I want to come back to that in later lectures and in tutorial. Page 13, Socrates says, painting or drawing and imitation in general are far removed from truth and have no true or healthy aim. And on page 14, he describes the maker of art as an inferior who marries an inferior and has inferior offspring. A copy of a copy of a copy of a copy, and of course the more copies that get added onto that chain, the worse it gets, the farther and farther away from reality we get. Okay, so we are in a sense continuing the critique that Socrates offered in the Ion. And next time, as we'll see, we do get some very strong echoes of the critique that Socrates offered in the Ion, having to do, as you guys know, with the nature of the poet's subject matter. We're not attacking the rhapsode anymore. We're attacking Homer directly, and we are accusing him of basically not knowing anything. That's going to come back, and we'll talk about that a bit next time. It's a continuation of the critique of the Ion, but I would say a much more hard-hitting critique, a much more fully worked out critique. As I was saying in an earlier lecture, it's kind of as though Plato, even though he's not a literary critic as such, there isn't any such thing in the ancient world, but Plato has a kind of Homer on the brain. Plato is a little bit obsessed, negatively obsessed, with the phenomenon of literature. And if in the Ion, to our question, what's literature good for, if in the Ion Socrates was kind of saying, well, not much, I don't think. In the Republic, Socrates is answering, I think, much more strongly. He's saying it's good for absolutely nothing. So next time we'll flesh out the remainder of that argument and also raise some more, let's say, gaps and question marks that we can discuss in tutorial. Okay, thank you very much, as always, for watching.